the media have to come up with some strategy to scare you into believing the authoritarians who are in charge of our COVID policy. So the latest point they're using is the death of Colin Powell. So yesterday, there were a lot of headlines that Colin Powell had died after being fully vaccinated. He had 2 shots of the vaccine. He had not gotten his booster yet. And then he had a breakthrough case of COVID and he died. And the initial headlines were all about how Colin Powell had died of a COVID breakthrough and what a disaster this was. Okay, so the initial headlines were like, the vaccines don't work. Okay, that's nonsense. He had multiple myeloma. He was severely immunocompromised. He had Parkinson's and multiple myeloma. Okay, so if you have a severe immunodeficiency, and if you are elderly, as he was 84 years old, then if you get a breakthrough case, if you get a cold, you could die from that, right? People who are elderly and are immunocompromised and are already sick tend to die when they get sick. It doesn't matter whether it's a breakthrough case of COVID or whether it's regular COVID, they just die at higher rates. But the media have to scare you. And it's not just about scaring you if you're elderly. They have to scare you personally. Somehow the media and your authoritarians of COVID, they need to come up with a rationale for why you need to remain extremely worried. Okay, now, what they're going to do is they'll say that states that are red and have not been as worried are bad states, right? Florida's a bad state. And then they'll just forget about it when everything is fine in Florida. So, for example, right now in Florida, extremely low transmission rates. In fact, the transmission rates of COVID in Florida right now, which of course is the worst state in America, right? It's Ron DeSantis and all that crap. The transmission rates in Florida right now are half the transmission rates in New York. You know who predicted this? Anyone with a brain. Because as we move into winter, which is really nice in Florida, and people are outdoors in Florida, and as we move into winter in the Northeast, where it's really gross outside and people spend their time indoors, the virus will move around indoors. And that's not about COVID policy. That is just about reality. When you're indoors in close contact with other people, people get sick more often. It's why for a very long time, people always thought that the way you got, my dad still thinks this, okay? The way you get a cold is because you're cold outside. Okay, it's not because you're cold outside. It's because you go from the cold outside to a place where you're in close contact with other people, and then you breathe on them, right? That is why people get sick during the winter. It is not because it is cold outside, and so it's cold, and you went outside without your mittens, and then you got a cold. That's not how you got sick, okay? So most viruses are transmitted through close contact with others. Close contact with others is maximized when the weather is ugly outside. Okay, but we have to pretend that Florida's super bad, right? Okay, so now they've moved on from that because Florida's no longer a story because Florida, the transmission rates are very low. So we're never going to hear about that again. Now, you never hear about it when DeSantis is doing fine. You only hear about it when DeSantis vaccinates most of the population and then bad stuff happens anyway. That's when you have to blame DeSantis. Okay, so the new narrative is you need to vaccinate so Colin Powell doesn't die. Okay, this is the actual piece over at the Washington Post today from Philip Bump. Quote, former Secretary of State Colin Powell died Monday morning from complications related to COVID-19. Powell's disease resulted from a breakthrough infection. He was fully vaccinated against COVID. But instead of demonstrating that the vaccine isn't 100% effective in preventing death, which was known, his death better serves to show the need to tamp down on coronavirus cases more broadly to help protect those most at risk. That group included Powell. He was 84 years old when he died, well into the elderly age group that has most been ravaged by the virus. He'd also been diagnosed with multiple myeloma, which can reduce the body's ability to fight infections. Last week, the CDC released data showing the effectiveness of vaccines in curtailing new infections and deaths from coronavirus. In August, it found those who were vaccinated were 6 times less likely to become infected and 11 times less likely to die of COVID-19. But the data also showed a disparity in the death toll. The incidence of COVID deaths among those 80 and over was nearly as high as the incidence among the unvaccinated age 50 to 64, which again is not shocked. I know we're supposed to be surprised by that when, again, people above the age of 80 die for lots of reasons because when you're old, you tend to die much more easily than when you are younger. Just the simple math. Says Philip Bump, older Americans have always been at more risk from COVID. The effects of the virus are clearly more pronounced with members of that age group even when they are vaccinated. This should not be an impetus of denialism. It is not the case that this demonstrates that vaccines are futile or not useful. Instead, it's a reminder the virus still poses a risk to the elderly even when vaccinated, and therefore that the goal should be to tamp down on the spread of the virus broadly. If Powell had been at little risk of contracting the virus because transmission rates were low, he would have been at almost zero risk of dying from it. But instead, his death comes at a time when more than 80,000 people a day are still contracting the virus and more than 1,500 people a day are dying from it, about as many people as were dying in early April of 2020. Okay, now, here's the thing. If you're talking about reaching herd immunity, we have yet to see the country that has hit quote-unquote herd immunity to the point where there is no transmission of virus. The asymptomatic are transmitting the virus. So barring full-time masking of everyone and 100% vaccination rates, none of which is achievable, there will be cases where people who are immunocompromised come into contact with the virus and then get sick and then die. because unfortunately, that is just the way the world works. When Philip Bump says, we need to force vaccinate cops so Colin Powell doesn't die, I'm sorry, but this is not the way we treat literally any, Anthony Fauci himself, the great god of COVID, Anthony Fauci has said, we have eradicated to date one disease on planet Earth. The notion that you're going to be able to eradicate a disease that is currently circulating in literally millions of people around the globe and ensure that everybody who's immunocompromised is fully safe without any protections, that's kind of wild. By the way, should you be that worried about a COVID breakthrough killing you? The answer is no. The statistical proof on this is pretty obvious. There have been 187 million people in the country who've been fully vaccinated. Of those 187 million people, about 7,200 have died. And about 85% of those deaths were people over 65. And most of those people had conditions that compromised their immune systems, apparently. This is according to Politico. And so I'm not sure what you think the purpose of yelling at people is, but apparently the purpose of yelling at people is to just intimidate you into silence. Right? That's the goal. Now, is any of this really effective? Like, everybody who wants to get vaccinated has now been vaccinated. And the vaccines provide incredible protection. Can we move on at any point here? Or is the authoritarianism the point? Again, I think this is a psychological problem in half the country right now. I think that a huge number of people on a financial level, on a personal level, on a health level have decided that all risk is worthy of avoidance. And that in order to mitigate the risk, we have to have somebody who knows better, an expert, who crams down on your neighbors what you can't cram down on your neighbors yourself. The best way to mitigate risk is to make sure that your neighbors are controlled. And so you got a media invested in that ideology. You have the government invested in that ideology. There's only one problem. None of it works. And in fact, you have unforeseen risks. Like, for example, the risk of crime that goes up when you fire a bunch of cops. Or the risks that the economy dies when you tell everybody that they are unsafe when they go back to work. There are a bunch of actual risks that materialize the moment you say that you have quashed all risk. The Titanic is the safest ship afloat up until the moment it rams directly into an iceberg. The thing here is that the iceberg is completely foreseeable. I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date with all our future content.